Cameroonian forest, fisheries and fauna law, one for incentives, forestry incentives for those who own small lands and agroforestry in Guatemala, the Kenyan Forestry Act, and the Venezuelan Biodiversity Management Act. And a lot of these have to do generally with creating positive incentives for conservation. And the upside is that a lot of these positive incentives are actually having effects that are complementary for climate change adaptation. So, for example, the Kenyan Forestry Act sets up community forest management agreements, and these have proven to be an effective way to preserve forests, and that's actually going to be quite significant in trying to adapt to climate change or maintaining. I'll move on to the next target specifically, because I think that we're talking about maintaining the integrity of natural ecosystems. Reducing direct pressures by reducing the loss of all natural habitats by either half or, where feasible, brought close to zero, and reducing degradation and fragmentation. And if you look at the language of this target, it's quite clear that it could be quite closely linked into reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. In both cases, we're looking to try and maintain the integrity of forest ecosystems, either for adaptation, mitigation, or for biodiversity purposes. But in the end, the outcome is the same, that we've achieved the protection of life in a way that hopefully will help support the resilience of natural ecosystems, so that ecosystems can continue supplying ecosystem services that we all rely upon. And kind of adaptation goals like ecosystem resilience, food and water security, carbon sequestration, etc. And so we have looked at a couple of acts, like the Forest Act of Gambia, National Environmental Management Act of South Africa on biodiversity, and the Vietnamese biodiversity law, just on how they've been successfully creating protected areas, but then also working to reduce degradation and fragmentation outside of those protected areas. The last target that I chose for this talk was target 14 of the IG targets, which is specifically linked to preservation of ecosystems. So I thought it was important to raise this one because it is the one target that talks about ecosystem scale conservation, or preserving something larger than simply a species. When we think about typical biodiversity law, we are thinking species conservation or protected area or whatever. But here we're actually talking about ensuring or enhancing benefits from biodiversity and ecosystem services by safeguarding and restoring ecosystems that provide essential services and contribute to health, livelihoods, and well-being, but also while taking into account needs of women, indigenous and local communities, and the poor and vulnerable. So there's clearly a social component here, and actually, if one thinks about the discussion about red safeguards, it kind of ties into this target, making sure that we can guarantee that ecosystems continue to provide ecosystem services that are necessary for human well-being, while at the same time not locking anybody off of their lands, making sure that people can still access water, making sure people can still access food. So not necessarily excluding anybody when you are actually trying to undertake these measures that conserve biodiversity, may also assist in adaptation and climate change. So we looked at a couple of different laws. We've done this study on Costa Rica's Ley Forestal, which sets up the payment for ecosystem services in Costa Rica. We're going to look at a couple of Mexican laws on the Ley de Aguas Nacionales, and also the Sustainable Forest Management Law of Mexico, which sets up their payment for environmental services scheme. And then there's also been a very new law adopted in the state of Acre in Brazil on creating a state system for incentives for ecosystem services. So there are quite a lot of laws that are out there, and what we're trying to do is bring kind of some studies of those to create a legal analytical tool online. Let's see. Okay, I'll just describe the initiative since I've discussed these kind of general topics. It's actually a partnership between two distinct organizations, one of which is International Development Law Organization in Rome, which is an intergovernmental organization, and the organization that I work for, which is the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. We have actually both a climate change law program and biodiversity law program. I'm the program coordinator for biodiversity, and Jorge Cabrera Medaglia is the head of that. And so what we've been trying to focus in this joint initiative is actually improving implementation of the CBD. This is a big question. I mean, same problem with the UN and CCC is like it's all about the implementation, and the fact that a lot of countries have had problems with legal implementation. So we've written this analytical working paper to try and develop some of the underlying themes, and we really focused on ones that were not necessarily traditionally conservation-based. So we were really looking at ones that were kind of cross-systemic targets that had both environmental, economic, and social impacts. And so they're really going outside of the traditional boundaries of conservation law to try and tackle some of these more systemic issues where you have to involve the Ministry of Finance, where you have to involve the Ministry of International Trade, where you have to involve every government organization and not simply the Ministry of Environment, because in many instances these other agencies may be working directly against what the Ministry of Environment is trying to do. So in terms of our capacity development and building, a lot of it is spreading knowledge about how we can have interministerial dialogue and cooperation, and it would be very important in this instance to actually have the people working on climate change, the people working on land degradation, the people working on biodiversity to all be on the same page and talking to one another and making sure that the finance ministry is on board and the people who want to implement this at all levels are on board. So what we've tried to do is our next step is to, we've been doing case study reports on the laws to try and get in-depth knowledge, but then we're also developing an online legal toolkit which will allow in-country legal professionals, government officials, etc. to go to a website where they can actually delve into some of the legal best practices that we've developed on specific IG targets, read the case studies, read examples of how to implement or just basic capacity building, trying to help people understand this area a lot better and what their obligations are to implement the CBD strategic plan. And so we're hoping that essentially we can draw upon some best practices that can then be transposed to other countries. And I'd like to, I guess, bring it to kind of the group questions that I thought of, which is really, we're talking about how can we both aim for climate change adaptation and reducing biodiversity loss at the same time. And so I was kind of looking at the three targets that I just mentioned here on incentive schemes, on natural habitat conservation, reducing degradation, and also restoring and safeguarding ecosystems. Just to feed into our project, it would be helpful if any of you have any in-country examples of national or subnational laws that might be useful in achieving one of the IG targets. I've also noticed that in the debate on adaptation, there's a large discussion on mainstreaming climate change adaptation. In the CBD, there's also a big discussion on mainstreaming biodiversity. So my question is, can we mainstream biodiversity and adaptation at the same time? Is that possible? I think that it is, but it really means people have to start thinking about it now. And then what further actions can we take as the initiative to further build awareness and capacity to look at this kind of synergistic implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity, other related treaties. We've been looking at all the biodiversity treaties, but also looking at economic law, looking at social law, really looking quite broadly to try and see how many treaties we can kind of implement at once without causing conflicts and kind of trying to reach the best outcomes. That is all, and thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, any questions? Someone get a microphone.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Pretty much all of my life, I've been a legal drafter moving in the developing country world where everything you're saying just, it's a personal experience of mine. And I'm so happy that you're doing this and that people are continuing to follow up with this. I have just a really informational question. You said that you are starting a website that is giving tips to lawyers and wherever on best practice or this kind of thing. Could you talk a little more about that and also then give us the website?
Okay, so the website is not functional yet, but it's essentially, like I mentioned, this is a collaborative project between the IDLO and the CISDL. We're also working with the Secretary of the CBD. They're our main backer. The Japan Biodiversity Fund is providing the funds for the project. So the main outcome was actually this capacity development tool. So we're currently in the process of developing a website where we can share these experiences that we've been developing. So there's no website currently in existence. However, it's a key part of our project outcomes, and we'd like to have a kind of a first draft by the 11th Conference of the Parties next month to the CBD. And we'll be having some side events and discussing there, but it's really about, we've been trying to build up the basis, do the core research, build the links between IG targets, build up our research team, all of this type of stuff, so that we can build this into a multi-year project where we'll have the legal tool as actually a key aspect of it. That's really what all this research is trying to lead into, is to create a tool to share that knowledge.
But again, we do have kind of a draft, like with us here, we do have kind of a draft overview of the legal and institution, the design of what this online tool would look like. And that's something that, we would love to meet with people and get feedback on how useful you think it is, what other aspects, how can we make it more user-friendly and accessible and meeting the needs of it. So that's something that we're here actually this week to do as well, if anyone who's interested. So it would be great to sit down with them. No, yeah.
We can send it to you. It's definitely available. So it's really like looking at what are the international laws that this specific domestic law implements. What are the specific provisions? What are key legal and institutional reforms? What are administrative measures that they've adopted? Like trying to look really at the whole implementation of the law in each of its discrete parts, and saying, yeah, maybe this law actually does implement both the Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity at the same time, and it also implements the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and also implements blah 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 blah. So that's what we're trying to make clear to countries, is maybe rather than focusing on implementing this one law, you can actually notice that your law is actually implementing 5 international treaties that you're a party to.
And my question, I'm Jay Pendergrass with the Environmental Law Institute. How much is your focus on the provisions of laws versus the implementation of those particular countries? We do both. We try to focus more on the implementation, but you have to have it first to get started. And the ones that you list, I'm trying to write them down, but we're doing similar things, and I definitely want to talk about your program, but also getting those so that we can sort of all spread the word.
So definitely contact us. But I think that our interest is in implementation. It's not really in fancy legal provisions, because I'm pretty sure that everyone can write up some fancy legal provisions that are totally unimplementable. But what we're looking at is at least we have some recommendations that this is some nice legal language, and then what we're trying to do is then actually do a case study on how has this been implemented, was it a success, who succeeded, who failed, what actors were benefited, what actors failed, who had to be convinced domestically to actually further implementation. So we're trying to mine fairly deeply beyond just that simple initial text. So hopefully the initial text is good and then actually led to some concrete implementation, rather than, we actually steered away from, with the CISDL, I work with a number of different organizations, and one of them was looking at promoting model laws on biodiversity, and unfortunately, from my experience, model laws have not been a great success. And so what we're trying to do here is look at specific laws that do exist on the ground and that were successful in implementation. So it really has to be like, we want to help people. We don't want to just say, hey, here's another model law for you to model yourself out, if those other ones didn't work for you.
And as Fred listed on that last slide, that's kind of that case study report that we were talking about. We've got lawyers, we've selected in the legal best practice summaries, we'll have about 20 so far and going on more if we can, but we've selected 4 in which we have a Kenyan lawyer in Kenya meeting with the government, meeting with stakeholders to say, you know, is this really working? Where do we need more capacity building? Where do we need legal empowerment? We have lawyers in Vietnam,
Cameroon, Vietnam, Kenya, and
and that's why we want to tell kind of the added value of actually on the ground, real research of the pros and cons.
it's not a desk study, is essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it extremely real and gather all the information on the ground so we can tell other countries, like, if you want to try and do this, you have to go to the Ministry of Finance and talk to somebody, you have to go to the Ministry of Forest and talk to somebody, you have to get them all to get along and then support your law. Good luck.
Yeah, there's the first one, getting Ministry of Finance to even talk to the Ministry of Environment.
Exactly.
Actually, I have just a specific question about the one in Lotte in Brazil. You have people there?
I don't have much on it yet, but I do have a Brazilian who's interested in doing it. So it's really, I mean, it appears to be fairly novel in implementation. It's quite new, at least since late 2010. So it's something that we flagged as potentially interesting, but we then have to start getting more on the ground. So
yeah, that's one we're doing some work there.
great. That'd be great too.
But I don't know about that one, so I want to find out.
It's very new, but it's essentially a payment for ecosystem services scheme within a current province. And again, it's kind of trying to build up through our networks and find people in country who have that experience. And so we'll find a Portuguese-speaking lawyer and we'll start delving into it.
Thank you. One more.
One
Do we have
more.
another question, please?
Right,
Yes.
in determining the success of implementation, do you have a set of indicators for different sectors as to what you consider success or not? And there may be some middle way, not yet successful, but progressive. So do you have a set of indicators?
I can't say that we've kind of reached a point where we have a concrete set of indicators, but I think that it, again, comes back down to having accurate data. Because it's hard to judge whether a policy has been successful or not if you don't actually have the data behind it. So for the Cameroonian forest law, for example, we actually have data demonstrating that, you know, the number of protected sites went up. They're now up to 20% of the national territory. That you know, concrete advantages were realized for local communities using tax incentives and this kind of thing. And as a result, the amount of intact forest in Cameroon has increased. So it's really kind of trying to tie it back to actual environmental data, because I think that's one of the ways that you can tell whether it's been successful or not, rather than just talking to people and saying, oh yeah, that was really a great success. Well, you have to go back to the statistics to determine whether it actually was or not, determine whether deforestation was actually reversed or not.
Would data be misleading sometimes?
Of course. I think it really comes down to trying to determine whether it was a success, you know, talking to the local communities, talking to governments, trying to talk to everybody who's involved rather than simply trying to rely on one person's data, which may be misleading. Generally, I guess obviously the one right now is that forest cover doesn't actually mean that any species inside the forest are still alive. So that's obviously something that conservationists are a bit concerned about right now. But so we always have to, it comes down to being able to find the data that supports your conclusions. And so that'll be a part of the case study is actually trying to determine. I will cut myself off.
Right. And just one last comment, in terms of you saying you're doing work in Brazil, that is highly relevant. While we say this is an IDLO and CI project supported by the Secretariat, this is really a project that we're doing in collaboration with many organizations. We have an expert advisory board with IUCN representation, with power representation, and that's what we want this project to be, not a IDLO CI but something where we can reach out and collaborate. And these case study reports, the project is right now 1 year, but we're in partnership with the World Bank, with FAO, to do these additional case study reports, and whether we collaborate in terms of reach assistance, with funding, with contacts, that's all something that we want to grow together with the group of organizations that are gathered here and all over. So,
I mean, we have our own particular skills. I'm an environmental lawyer, but I focus on sustainable development law, and IDLO is a development law organization. So we recognize that our specialties are in that field. And we also need to work with everybody else in the field who has their own areas of expertise so that we can be successful. We can't say, hey, we've got our own silo over here where we're trying to work on legal implementation from this extremely narrow perspective and we don't want anybody else's help. No, we've gone out and gotten an expert panel covering a number of intergovernmental organizations, just trying to say, you guys have the expertise here and we want to work with you. It was important for us to get IUCN on as a partner very early on because IUCN is the intergovernmental organization with expertise on conservation, and we can't pretend that that's who we are. We're someone different.
Fred and Yolanda, thank you. There's quite a bit of interest there, and I encourage all of you to continue that discussion through lunch and throughout the week. I'll be talking as well. So, could we get the slide on the questions, please? So I'm just going to explain the next hour until lunchtime. John's going to be our timekeeper, so he'll take over after this. For those who have just arrived, or have arrived since the morning, in the first session we had a breakout group where groups divided up and